That is the tank they named after me when they found out it was no damn good. Hi, Misha here, and we have had a lot of fun, I hope anyway, looking at Russian tanks, armored vehicles. But now it's time to mix things up a bit. And I figured, let's go to Britain. And if we're going to talk about British tanks, I don't know. I gotta talk about the Churchill. It's not the first, not probably the best, but it's just iconic British. I don't know. And that's kind of British tanks. They weren't the best in World War II. In fact, in 1940-41, they were often thought of as unreliable, underpowered, slow, even undergunned. Yet they had a certain something. They were tough and robust. They had heavy armor. And they were tenacious. They could go over a lot of terrain. They were known for being easy to push through forests, heavy brush, mud. Yeah, which has a lot to do with their World War I roots in a lot of ways. So this is the infantry tank, Mark IV, later named the Churchill. Started off as the A-22, evolved into the A-22F, which was renamed to the A-42 around 1945. But there were several Marks, because of course they were. And we have several 1/72 scale diecast. Over here we've got a couple of Mark IIIs. In the middle, a couple of Mark IVs, very closely related. And then finally, we have the main ultimate version, the Mark VII. These are from a few different makes, including Dragon and Forces of Valor, and even an Oxford. So with that, let's do our first Brit. This is a Mark III, but we have to go back quite a ways. In fact, to a different tank. Right before World War II and in the beginning, there was a call in Britain for a supplemental and potential replacement for the Matilda 1 and 2, as well as the Valentine tank. But the specifications that were drawn up didn't care much about speed, and many in the British military at the time thought that the 2-pounder, the QF 2-pounder gun, which was about a 40 millimeter gun, which was an anti-tank gun that did okay. Actually, it did pretty well for this point in the war against the panzers of the day before they were up-armored. But it wasn't really a good general purpose gun. It was specifically an anti-tank gun. So, but this is what they really wanted to arm them with. Basically, they cared about armor in the gun because they wanted something able to traverse cratered, rocky terrain, to cross trenches, to not get mucked down. Essentially, they were thinking about fighting World War I all over again, trench warfare. And so the tank was to attack a fixed fortification. And it really just wasn't built for mobile warfare. This was called an infantry tank. It was just supposed to have enough speed to keep up with the, infantry, and to help support and break through. The first design was the A-20. And there would be a couple of prototypes ready for testing in June of 1940. It had that QF 2-pounder gun. It was about 32 tons. Originally, it had about 60 millimeter of armor. And it was terribly slow and, not effective. Still, they were going to order it, but then, the Blitzkrieg happened and Dunkirk happened, and that quickly showed them that this tank would not be worth anything. So the specifications were updated primarily by Dr. Martin, who looked at combat in Europe, namely Poland and in France, and came up with a new design. And this was transferred to Vauxhall, who worked on a new engine. Actually, it was kind of based on the Bedford truck engine. And the armor was upped to at least 100 millimeters. And they considered getting a larger gun in there, but at this time, 1940, there was still resistance. This would become the A-22, and 2 prototypes were ordered, but they had to be ready for service within a year, so summer of 1941. Very quick time. They did use some stuff. They started, for example, with the turret from the Matilda, and they used a very traditional drivetrain, chassis, engine, and the first prototypes were done right around Christmas, 1940, and really they met their target. They were ready for production, but what they had, which was now designated as the Mark IV infantry tank, sometimes called the heavy infantry tank, the Mark I version of the Mark IV, was not that impressive, frankly. It was about 39 tons, had a heavy front armor of over 100 millimeter. In the hull, it had one 2-pounder gun. In the turret, which was a very small turret at the time, cast, it had another 2-pounder gun. And it had one, later 2, 7.9 Misha machine guns. They didn't use 303 because it didn't work well in tanks, so they used the German 7.9 caliber. So what it had going for it was armor, and it had a decent gun layout for that day and time. What it didn't have was speed. It couldn't even quite get up to 16 miles per hour. But really what was pathetic was its range. It was a gas guzzler. It couldn't even make it 60 miles before it needed a top-off, a tipple. And because it was rushed into production, the factory knew immediately that it had problems. In fact, it was in the original manual that we know there's problems, we're working on it, but we needed to get these into production. So the Mark I was never fielded. I should say, originally it had the 2-pounder gun in the hull. Eventually, by the time they put it in production, they actually replaced that with the 3-inch howitzer. But this had its own problems. The idea was the 2-pounder in the turret could be an anti-tank gun, and the howitzer in the hull could be more of an anti-infantry, anti-fortification gun. But this didn't last. The Mark I would quickly give way to the Mark II, which replaced that 3-inch howitzer with another 7.9 millimeter machine gun in the hull. Part of it was logistics. Part of it was they just didn't have enough 3-inch howitzers to keep arming the tanks. So they only built 300 some odd Mark I's, but they would only, they would build about 1,100, a little more, Mark II's. But the Mark II really saw limited to no field use itself, because by 1942, finally, better minds prevailed in the British military, and the QF 6-pounder gun, which is about a 57 millimeter gun, started to be fitted to tanks, including the Churchill, which gets us now finally to our Mark III here, and our initial military service. Now this little model here is from Oxford, and it is of Major Norris King's tank, often known as King Force, which is a special task force in North Africa, which was one of the earliest times this saw combat. Now, the Mark III was the first major update and redesign of the Churchill. This was the factory trying to attempt to correct a lot of the known issues. It was somewhat successful. They went to a new turret. Now, the original Mark I, Mark II turret, it was round, cylindrical. Again, it was kind of inspired by the Matildas. But it was cast and it was heavy for its size and it was cramped and it really couldn't hold much bigger than that 2-pounder. The Mark III turret here is actually armor plates. It's rolled steel. Now, originally, Brits were fans of riveting bolting. But with this, they used a lot of welds in the turret. Now, some criticized the welding, saying, oh, it won't work. As soon as it gets hit, it'll crack along the weld seam. But Vauxhall and others thought they had it down. It turns out they were right. The welding was actually quite a bit lighter and allowed for the larger turret. It also had this compartment in the back. It was used for various things. Sometimes it was just literally a counterweight. Sometimes it was for ammo storage. Later on, it would be used as a telephone box, basically a TARDIS. This turret is kind of recognizable. It's very squared off, very angular, because it is plates joined together. And they would start bolting more armor on. Also, the Mark III was the first to introduce these so-called catwalks over the tops of the tracks. Before, like a World War I tank, the tops of the tracks were just there. They also introduced mud guards, although in the field they would sometimes take them away. But the big deal here was the new QF 6-pounder gun and the new turret. This would be the Mark III gun. There's the 7.9mm coaxially mounted. We have a second 7.9mm here in the hull. This has a crew of 5, driver, co-driver / hull gunner, commander, turret gunner, loader, and loader radio operator later on. Overall, it's about 24.5 feet. And at this time, like I said, the first ones were about 39 tons. Over time, it would grow to over 40 tons and even over 40.5 tons, just as they added more and more to it. They would sometimes add auxiliary fuel tanks because the range was still pretty rubbish. And this was about as good as it would get with speed. Like I said, not quite 16 miles per hour. But yeah, the first time that these saw combat was the Dieppe raid, August 19, 1942. It was pretty bad. But it wasn't really the tank's fault. 60 Churchills were sent. Only 30 made it on the beach. And of those, only 15 got off the beach. And they did get to the nearby town, but because their infantry and engineering support was very curtailed, they weren't able to get past anti-tank and fortifications and such, so they had to basically turn back. 10 of them made it back to the beach, and actually a lot of them took a bunch of abuse. The heavy armor really held up well. And they would fight until they were out of ammo, and after that there wasn't much they could do. So it was a pretty disastrous raid, but it wasn't really the Churchills' fault. But it wasn't an auspicious debut. Luckily, King Force in North Africa did show that the tank had merit. That summer, 2 Mark IIs and 6 Mark IIIs were sent for testing in the field, and they were used during the second battle for El Alamein in October. And they did very well. Only 1 out of the 8 was actually knocked out. It was only really partially penetrated. It did catch fire, but it wasn't a Ronson. It didn't go up in flames. The tank would take a lot of abuse. Yeah, it was slow, but there was a report of one that took 80 hits. And the new QF 6-pounder gun was doing quite well. And so this kind of saved the Churchill. There was talk at this time of canceling it, potentially replacing it with the Cromwell, which is under development. But the use in North Africa really did save it. And they continued to improve it. But they would only actually make, well, fewer than 700 Mark IIIs because the subcontractor that supplied these rolled steel plates for the new turret couldn't deliver, was tied up with other war things. That would lead us to the Mark IV. A very similar design here. In fact, the hull is virtually the same. The difference, this had a new cast turret, very much based on the Mark III's plate turret, but now they're using a lot more advanced casting technology. So unlike the Mark I, Mark II turret, it wasn't near as heavy. In fact, it was only about 400 or 500 pounds heavier, all things considered, not too shabby. And they were able to actually supply these in reasonably large numbers. In fact, this Mark IV here was the single most produced variant with over 1,600 made. It had a few other minor changes too. This would be the first time you'd start to see the telephone box really appear. They would add more armor, and they would go to a slightly improved QF6 gun, known as the Mark V. It had a little bit longer barrel than the Mark III, which gave it just a little bit more velocity. Keep in mind, though, this is still a 57mm gun. However, in North Africa, in the field, they did discover that the 75mm gun from the Sherman could be retrofitted to work with the new Mark III or Mark IV turret. So this was a field modification, sometimes referred to as the NA-75. They took guns from Shermans damaged in the field and stuffed them into the Churchill. And this was pretty successful. The truth is, the QF6, especially the Mark V, was a better anti-tank gun, better armor penetration gun than the original 75mm gun from the Sherman. However, the 75mm gun was a better all-around general purpose gun. It was kind of a jack of all trades, master of none, whereas the QF6 was an anti-tank gun. But they would produce these in 1943 predominantly. There would be a version known as the Mark V that replaced this gun with a 95mm, the QF95, which was essentially a howitzer. This was used for close infantry support. They didn't make many of those, fewer than 250, but it's kind of a cool, big, stubby gun variant. By this point, the design's not perfect, but it is starting to come into its own. But it's also starting to get heavier, crossing close to 40 tons, and they're not updating the engines, so speed's starting to drop. On the other hand, they are noticing that it's able to cross terrain and also climb pretty steep slopes, which is very important for a tank. A lot of tanks don't do slopes very well, but because of the really long tracks on these, and just the way the suspension and steering works, each track could be adjusted speed-wise independently, meaning you could actually turn. It's like a zero radius lawnmower. Not fast, but it could pretty much turn in place. It's pretty useful. It's starting to evolve into a pretty decent tank. The UK wasn't the only user of the Churchill. Here we have another Mark IV, but this one was one that was given to Russia under Lend-Lease war aid. About 344 Mark IIIs and Mark IVs were sent to Russia. with the first deliveries in June 1942. Now, of those sent over, about 260 made it. Many were lost in transit for obvious reasons, Germans. But they were put into the field very quickly, first being used, at least in any numbers, during the Battle of Stalingrad. And they would continue to see use throughout 1943. They were there at Kursk, and they were there at Kharkov. But the Russians were not terribly fond of them. The Russians did not seem to like British hardware, planes, tanks, automobiles, what have you. Maybe some of it was just kind of a cultural thing. But I think a lot of it just had to do with each nation had very much different notions in design. So in 1944, when Russia had enough T-34s and other vehicles, they retired their Churchills and they declined to receive more from England. As you know, they also received M4 Shermans. They even had Matildas and Valentines from the UK too, so in the beginning they took whatever they want. I just thought I'd show you this one real quick. Like I said, it's a Mark IV in Russian service. It doesn't have the radio box. It's quite the same. It has a little bit of the extension here, but just a little different. Got the cast turret. This is from Eagle Moss or Fabry in Russia. Moving turret. Die-gas model. But now we're about to get to our second major update. And this would be the kind of ultimate Churchill. Here we have the Mark VII. Like I said, the Mark V had the 95mm howitzer. The Mark VI was a short-lived version. They had been working on an improved design that could mount the QF-75 gun for some time. This was kind of a British take on the American gun. And again, it wouldn't be quite as good of an anti-tank gun, but just a better general-purpose gun with better high-explosive shells and what have you. The Mark VI was the first to mount this, but they only built about 200 because it was just an interim measure until the Mark VII was ready. The Mark VII kept, of course, the new QF-75 gun, but they enlarged and expanded the chassis. They added more armor. The front is up to 152mm now. Now keep in mind, that's really thick, but it's very square armor. It's not sloped. The sides and everything are improved too. The sides are almost 100mm. They would add more boxes and fuel tanks, better intakes, improved radios. Just generally speaking, kind of correcting everything they could with the design. And it was very successful. They would build about 1,400 of these. And they were first in the field in early 1944, and they first saw combat after D-Day in Normandy in the summer of 1944. And they were very good at breaking through hedgerows and just basically marching through the Low Countries towards Germany. They would cross terrain and environments that Germany thought were impassable to tanks, which is a bit of a historical irony when you consider the Maginot Line and the Blitzkrieg and all that stuff. So this was the last kind of major version that they would do. There would also be a Mark VIII, which was a Mark VII, but it was fitted with that QF-95 gun. They would build about 200 of those. Again, infantry support. And production would continue until 1945. But this is the most iconic version. In most ways, the best version. But it did have a few sacrifices. This model here, Honestly, I think it's Altea. It could be Atlas. They're pretty much the same tooling. It's actually a nice model. It's probably the heaviest. A lot of metal here. It's got the antenna in the back. Our turret does rotate. The barrel is, of course, a little thicker, and the barrel keeps getting longer and longer as we go to newer guns. Australia actually tried out the Churchill in 1944. They tried it out against the Sherman, paying a special attention to how it performed in tropical jungle iron environments, and they actually decided that it was a better fit for their needs than the Sherman, and they ordered 500 or more, but they only received about 50 by the end of World War II. That wasn't enough to really mess with, so even though they were planning on using it in the Australian Army, they really never did. But this did help the Allies stomp the Germans. In fact, the Churchill was the heaviest tank that the Allies had in World War II. And at this point, for the Mark VII, we're over 40.5 tons, close to 41 tons. And that is a bit of a problem. And our final model is from Forces of Valor. It's probably the nicest one. It's pretty much all metal, including the turret and gun. The gun does elevate. The tracks even roll. The wheels roll. By the way, this had 11 little bogies. Independent. It was a coil spring suspension. Pretty primitive. A lot of other British tanks would use the Christie suspension. But the nice thing about so many little wheels, it could lose several and keep on going. So, you know, pros and cons. By the way, this has a little commander poking out of the hatch. His name is Reginald. Yeah, it's just a little bit bigger overall. Heavier. We're carrying the 75mm gun. Telephone equipment. Radio equipment. But we never really updated that Bedford engine. It was already slow in the beginning, but all this extra weight, now it cannot even get up to 13 miles per hour. In fact, we're more like 12.5 top speed. Yeah, I mean, it's faster than walking pace, maybe, but it's about the best you can really say for it. It just, yeah, is what it is. But keep in mind, this was put together in the desperate days of the war. And it really did evolve into something special. It could really take a pounding. It was a good backbone. It was just a good, tenacious tank. I actually think it was very appropriately named after Churchill. Not elegant, not couth, not terribly refined, but tough, determined, dogged, and a little bit crass. Yeah, I'd say well met. The thing is, Winston Churchill in World War I was a big proponent of the tank. And he continued this in his various ministerial positions before and during World War II as well. But it was a tank of its time. So yeah, production ended in 1945. It would stay in the British military. They actually were planning to deploy it in Southeast Asia. In July of 1945, they started training up regiments, including with the Indian Army. And they were planning to put it in combat against the Japanese around October. But of course, the war ended, so they never were deployed. In fact, they were sent back to depots in that September, and then eventually crated up and shipped back to England. They would remain in the British military throughout the 40s. And their last major use came in the Korean War, late in 1950. They were sent over and were actually very helpful in defending Seoul, the capital, against the communists. And after that was done, they're pretty much pulled out of frontline service because tank warfare diminished later on in Korea. They would officially remain in the military for a bit longer, being declared obsolete in 1952, by which time we had plenty of other tanks: Cromwell, Comet, Centurion. Cool stuff. But this had its place in time. But it was also kind of the last of the big, heavy, slow, lumbering fortresses, very reminiscent of World War I. All told, they would build over 5,600 through several manufacturers and subcontractors. And in addition to that, over 3,000 earlier Mark I, IIs, IIIs were updated to later standards. The thing is, it was kind of a patchwork situation. So you have all kinds of marks and stars and slashes, and this tank might be from 1942, but then have later features or partial features. It gets pretty convoluted quite quickly. A lot of the times they were just updated as needed and as they get to the factory. And again, there were some field modifications like the NA-75s too. But yeah, the original, really the Mark III was the first version to be fully combat ready, combat capable. The Mark IV had some incremental improvements like the new gun, or the longer gun, same gun really, just longer bore. And of course the cast turret did save production quite a bit. But it was the Mark VII here with the better general purpose gun and the super heavy armor. In fact, it was really not just the heaviest armored tank of the Allies, but even counting German tanks, there's only a couple that were more heavily armored than this thing. It was a beast, which is good because it could not really move at any speed to speak of. But again, it had its purpose. It could climb much more vertical surfaces compared to other tanks. It could go over mud. It could bulldoze its way through brush and trees and even, heavier things. Reliability in the beginning was not great, but towards the end, they had it running pretty well. But it was always a petrol, a gasoline engine, so it was a bit of a fuel guzzler. Russia, by this point, had kind of learned the benefit of diesel, but at least for a military. But yeah, I just thought I'd show you these, and I thought this was a good place to start with British armor. It's just such a weird but cool looking tank, and very distinctly British. Also, I will confess, I lied a little bit. This Oxford is not 172 scale, it's 176 scale. For whatever reason, Oxford, that's their scale. But the difference is literally very slight. And I do like their stuff because it's pretty much all metal. Kind of nice. Moving turret. The Dragon, they're pretty much all plastic, unfortunately. Although they have nice detail. The Eagle Moss, the hull is metal. The turret is plastic. The tracks are rubber, though. The Forces of Valor, like I said, is probably the nicest. Nearly entirely metal, including the antenna. But the Altea, or Atlas, or De Agostini, they all pretty much use the same tooling here. It's kind of in between. I like it a lot, though. It's very heavy, it's very weighted, and it's quite affordable, about $20. But yeah, let me know what you think, and we will get to more British as soon as we can. This is Misha. Catch you very soon. Next time.